Guys, welcome back to part 2 of our series on Jacques Vallee, his ideas, his theories on the UFO phenomenon, what they mean, and why it's so important. In part 1, we saw Vallee debunk the extraterrestrial hypothesis, highlighting the inconsistencies and absurdities in the idea that an extraterrestrial race would come here and behave so strangely. He then explores what may in fact be going on. If this phenomenon is not traveling from another world, what are its intentions? He realizes the best way to figure this out is to look at the social impact of the UFO phenomenon in the world, the impact that it has on the individual contactees, on the cults and organizations that they form, and on the belief systems of the wider human population. Vallee finds consistent strands of social impact across all of these phenomena, including racist ideologies, utopian ideals, and the abdication of human responsibility. But in today's session, we get to look at the most fascinating parts of messengers of deception, and indeed actually a wider discussion of the UFO phenomenon and Vallee's theories about it. Today we're going to be asking whether that UFO phenomenon that he described may be being in part simulated by human actors in the world today. Vallee wrote his book in 1977, but his hypotheses are even more compelling today because it's been 50 years since he wrote this work, and technology has advanced significantly. Believe me, by the time we've finished with this session, your whole perspective on the UFO phenomenon may have changed. The best place to start, as always, is with a quote from the man himself. This is Jacques Vallee. The Manipulators. I have given this name to the hypothetical agents who might cause the UFO contacts and engineer their effects. Everything now centers on their role, their identity, their designs. Who could they be? Alien beings coming from the end of the galaxy? Psychic entities from the other side? Automata controlled by some non-human consciousness? Holographic nightmares? But perhaps we are looking far away for something which is right under our nose. Could they simply be human? Could they be masters of deception, so skillful that they plan to counterfeit an invasion from space? There are people today in 2025 who are concerned that what we're seeing happen around us, yes, may be a real phenomenon, but may be being mixed in with a manipulated one, with a simulation, with an attempt to engineer our behaviors to drive us towards certain kinds of conclusion without considering the possibility that this phenomenon may indeed be engineered. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that seems outright impossible. Surely that technology doesn't exist. But Vallee, not someone you would describe as a stupid individual, in 1977 believed that it was possible, and we are now 50 years after that fact. And Vallee ties this belief not only to his own thoughts and ideas, but to an individual that he met called Major Murphy. According to Vallee, Major Murphy's actual rank is much higher than Major. I think we can assume that this is probably a general, and that this individual served in World War II and had insider knowledge related to the UFO phenomenon. Now, in the final section of the book where Vallee documents his interaction with Major Murphy, it's remarkable. It's fascinating. It's a real moment in the book where your consciousness is elevated and you realize there are people within the government who really believed this in 1977, that such simulations might be possible. And I struggled to condense this down to a small, manageable series of quotes. So I've actually taken quite a lot out of the book to read through. But believe me, it's worth it. The things that he says will change the way that you think about the UFO phenomenon forever. Remember, everything I'm about to read to you was written, documented, and these conversations were had 50 years ago. Here is Vallee's interaction with Major Murphy. He writes, "I took all my papers one day and drove to the house of Major Murphy, who had advised me to pursue my research of the contactee groups. We quickly agreed that the popular idea of flying saucers from outer space left much to be explained. The Major, who was still closely following government-funded research on parapsychology in the United States and seemed well aware of similar advances in the Soviet Union, suggested that UFOs might not be spacecraft, but what he called psychotronic devices. In 1943, he said, as we sat in his study, we already had evidence that several countries were working on circular aircraft that they hoped to develop into secret weapons. The Germans were also doing advanced research on controlled electrical discharges and controlled lightning, and tried to combine these things together. When we invaded Germany, a lot of hardware fell into our hands, but the Russians got most of the good stuff. Then people started seeing the modern UFOs in Sweden in 1946. Suppose somebody had obtained a device by the end of the war, which perhaps wasn't a very effective weapon. Perhaps it couldn't fly very effectively, couldn't carry guns and bombs, but had other properties. For instance, it could emit radiation that caused paralysis and hallucinations as it flew over an area, so that witnesses exposed to it would think they saw the phantasms of their own imagination. Did somebody test that kind of device in Sweden in 1946 and in the States in 1947 and find it to be ineffective as a flying machine, but very useful as a means of propaganda? Has such a group already understood what UFOs were, and are they confusing the issue by simulating UFO waves? Or is the entire phenomenon under their control? I can only tell you that silent disc-shaped flying machines can be built. If they are equipped with the right devices, they can create astonishing effects and be reported as flying saucers. I wish I still had my files on the German experiments. Remember, Jacques Vallee vouches for the credibility of this individual. He says that he was involved in the UFO phenomenon, had insider information, and is ranked incredibly highly. And Vallee takes him as a credible individual. And this person is saying that when we think about disc-shaped craft being developed in Nazi Germany in the 40s, we should not be thinking of the Nazis as just developing aerospace technologies, but also what he calls psychotronic technologies, that is, technologies designed to impact the mind. And perhaps by accident, the Nazis had stumbled across this technology and had begun to realize quite how capable it was. Vallee continues. Suppositions, I thought. Assumptions. We're going to need more than that to explain the UFO phenomenon. Major, I can't believe that some Nazi group had managed to survive secretly with this kind of technology in its power. The Major responds, who says anything about the Nazis? I am suggesting that other groups have become involved. Germany was simply a little ahead of other people. A lot of people got involved. Industrial concerns, laboratories engaged in psychotronic research. The Nazi research on microwaves was child play compared to the sophistication of modern experiments. Reminder, modern means 1977. If someone is using this technology, we can assume that they also mastered pharmacology, the use of drugs to distort the memories of witnesses, the use of mind control to suggest stories and to plant fake observations. Don't you think people should try to get some information about that before believing in friendly space visitors? Vallee retorts, it's hard to believe that these techniques would already be applied on this kind of scale. Major Murphy responds, don't you read the newspapers? Don't you follow the publications on mind control? The military has been using this kind of technique for years. He pulled out a file of a series of New York Times clippings. It described part of a US project which spanned 35 years and involved hypnosis, narcoanalysis, electronic brain simulation, and the behavioral effects of every physical vibration known to science, from ultrasound to microwaves. This is by far the most fascinating part of Messengers of Deception. It's one thing to talk about the social consequences of the phenomenon and how you can pull out a coherent set of strands of how it's changing the way that society thinks and changing culture. It's another thing to say that human beings may have been creating and simulating UFO events in order to create those effects. Quite a remarkable hypothesis, But I wonder if it makes you think about what is going on around us today. Is this part of a plan? Is this part of some sort of conspiracy to drive human beings towards some kind of outcome? The thing is, when you look through our history, especially in the post-war era, there is plenty of evidence that this kind of advanced mind control, parapsychological and psychotronic capability exists. Go back to the 1700s, look at the Enlightenment philosophers, and all of them recognized, even in the 1700s, that the human mind is actually just a stew of the sense data that comes towards us and our own creation of images in our minds. That tells you everything you need to know about the ability to manipulate human perception. If we're already cooking up images in our heads, all you need to do is get into the kitchen that exists inside of the brain. And what we find as we look through post-war history is tons of evidence that the governments around the world have been trying to figure out exactly how to do this. Isn't it interesting that while in 2025 we're allowed to think about UFOs, there's still no serious conversation about MK Ultra? Isn't it interesting that while we're allowed to speculate about the origin of these craft potentially coming from other planets and other places in the galaxy, we're not encouraged to think about the mind control experiments that were done in Nazi Germany and done in America? Those are two conversations that haven't been brought together yet, and yet they may be inextricably linked together. MK Ultra tells us that the government has confidence that you can manipulate perception inside of the human mind. Remote viewing tells us that human perception can extend beyond the physical body. These are remarkable things with enormous implications for how we think about what the brain and what consciousness is. And as you begin to blow open the box of our normal perception of how these things work, it actually becomes more and more feasible that you could manipulate how things are perceived inside of the brain. In 2016, when To the Stars Academy was launched, and people were revealed to these sort of new set of advisors for the first time, Jim Semivan, Steve Justice, Hal Puthoff, Lou Elizondo, and of course Chris Mellon, there was also a lot of public attention put on these individuals. And Christopher Mellon's interesting, because on his personal website, an individual found a file that seemed to have been left exposed that perhaps shouldn't have been left exposed, or maybe it was intentionally left there. This was a PowerPoint deck of a presentation that was given to people in the Department of Defense about the UFO phenomenon. And infamously, in that PowerPoint deck, slide number 9 talked about how the science exists for an enemy of the United States to manipulate both physical and cognitive environments in order to penetrate US facilities, influence decision makers, and compromise national security. And in bullet points below this are listed the following: psychotronic weapons, cognitive human interface, penetration of solid surfaces, instantaneous sensor disability, alteration and manipulation of biological organisms, anomalies in the space-time construct, and unique cognitive human interface experiences. It is totally possible that this slide deck is part of some really clever deception, that it was intentionally left in the deep web for some really smart researcher to find so that we would have this conversation. But this is just one of many indicators that people inside of the Department of Defense take the idea of cognitive influence and of brain manipulation incredibly seriously. I want to read you an excerpt from Jacques Vallee's most recent journals, documenting the period from 2010 to 2019. So we're looking here sort of 40 years after the writing of Messengers of Deception. And in his entry for Friday the 18th of September 2015, Vallee documents the following: stunning new commentary from a medical expert. We've had a conversation before about the LIDA4 that went to a brain research institute where Dr. Russ Agee tested it, but I never considered any applications of interest to us. Now it seems that stimulation of near-surface cortical edge receptors in the visual cortex may affect our interference candidates. The device puts subjects to sleep and made them see certain things. Is that a clue to the unfolding of more sensational encounters? In general, they didn't believe the results until 1983. They were not published till 2011, 28 years later. The article shows that the culprit is in fact intracellular heating. John Schuessler has circulated a reminder that much more was done. A Los Alamos study on these technologies ended in 1985 and has been declassified, but that was 30 years ago. 5 years ago, DARPA was briefed on the first 30 UFO patients studied with signs of the inflammatory reaction in white matter and Virchow-Robin spaces. After the briefing, a very disturbed DARPA scientist in tears told Kit, "It's us, technology from Sandia. Meet me at the briefing room." But when Kit got there, the security personnel told him the session had been cancelled. I don't understand the science of this. I'm happy to acknowledge that. But clearly, Dr. Jacques Vallee takes it seriously. And it seems that what he's saying here is that scientists have discovered ways to put people to sleep and to make them see things inside of their mind, and that there are scientists inside of the defense and intelligence community who are working on this in the 80s, right? And Vallee spoke with someone in the 70s who said people have been working on this already for a long period of time, stretching back 35 years. So at this point, this would be almost a century of people playing with mind control and putting images in people's minds. And that terrifying entry at the end there involving Kit Green, one of Vallee's close associates, being told to come and meet this person in the meeting room because they're saying, "It's us, it's our technology, we're the ones doing this to people." Another interesting entry comes just a little bit further in the journals, Sunday the 17th of January 2016. Another one of Jacques Vallee's close colleagues, John Schuessler. John Schuessler sends along a note about an article describing how to turn the brain off. He writes, "I found it fascinating because it shows there is a mechanism, at least in mice, which can mimic what has been reported in many UFO cases. They found that by making thalamus cells fire with a frequency of 10 Hz, caused the mice to lose consciousness. If they fired the cells at between 450 and 100 Hz, the mice woke up again." Vallee then continues, "My notes reflect that it's the same with humans. It was first discovered by Andrea Baharic and Jose Delgado in secret CIA collaboration, along with the MKUltra program, revealed a few years ago when some smart staffer discovered it among the 100,000 pages declassified in 1986. Those two guys had netted diagrams from an atlas of both human and cat brains, where the thalamus was clearly delineated." Imagine that, the ability to turn a brain on and off just by changing frequencies. Dr. Vallee mentioned Andrea Baharic, who you probably might have heard something about, but if you haven't, this is an individual really worth paying attention to. Baharic was recruited by the army to look into a lot of this psychic phenomenon during the post-war period, and as mentioned here as well by the CIA as well, he was really crucial to the MKUltra program and to this whole world of mind control. There's a really fascinating story documented in Annie Jacobson's wonderful book, Phenomena. I've not read the whole thing, but I've read the first chunk of it. And in that chunk, you get the story of Andrea Baharic. And there is this fascinating case where Baharic gets access to somebody who's hearing voices in their mind. So they're hearing things in their head. They're hearing things they don't recognize. It's really scaring them. And so Baharic brings them in. And what he does is he puts them inside of a Faraday cage, basically a mechanism designed to prevent things from coming in and out. And they notice that the noises disappear. The key to figuring out what was going on was to look at the individual's day job. I'm going to read a section here from Phenomena to elucidate this. I guarantee you're going to find this absolutely fascinating. The individual was called McCulloch. McCulloch was a local machinist whose psychiatric medical profile was completely normal other than the sudden audio aberration. Before the voices appeared, the machinist had displayed no symptoms of insanity. Whereas many a 1950s doctor would have written this man off as crazy, Baharic and his foundation had found another theory to pursue. They believed the man might be hearing voices that were traveling on a radio wave, that the machinist was somehow tuned in to a specific radio frequency that other individuals could not hear. "We found out that his job was the key to the diagnosis," Baharic wrote. In the machine shop where the man worked, the machinist's daily routine was grinding metal casings against carborundum wheels for hours at a time. At the foundation facility, Baharic's research team gave the man a dental examination, which showed that his metal fillings were coated with carborundum dust, or silicon carbide, a semiconductor. The carborundum behaved like the crystal rectifier in the old crystal radio sets of the 1920s, wrote Baharic. When the subject was placed inside the Faraday cage, all electrical and radio signals were eliminated. We found that his voices ceased, his teeth were cleaned, and he was cured of the psychiatric problem. The man was never crazy to begin with. Rather, we found that he was precisely tuned to radio station WOR in New York City. Did you know that you can make people hear things inside of their minds by placing certain kinds of metal inside of their mouths? According to Andrea Baharic, a CIA scientist who also worked for the army and is highly regarded across many fields, that is possible, and it was done in the 1950s. This is remarkable. So now we have conversations here about MK Ultra. We've got slide 9 about this cognitive interface and the ability to manipulate consciousness. We've got Andrea Baharic and the ability to use metals to make people hear things inside of their minds. And we've got these articles from Jacques Vallee and John Schuessler, which they found talking about how to turn the brain on and off and make things appear inside of their minds. Are you getting the picture yet? This stuff is real. I don't want to belabor all the other points that I've got documented here because there's a few too many of them, so let me rattle them through pretty quickly. Jim Semivan talking about Havana Syndrome. Havana Syndrome is very interesting. This appears to be some kind of psychotronic weapon that's being used to really hurt people's brains and to cause them all sorts of injuries. Here is Jim Semivan talking about this with James Iandoli from Engaging the Phenomenon.
The technology used, and let's say the Havana Syndrome, that technology has been around a while. Yeah, you can create voices inside people's heads. As far as creating scenarios, false memories, that would probably mean that the technology has advanced considerably since the 70s, when it was first being, experimented with. But the technology, you can buy it, you can buy the equipment, yourself and do it yourself. It's not that complicated. And essentially what you're doing is, you're putting these, well, I don't want to get into the wave patterns and stuff, but, you're trying to read, clear text, inside something. You're trying to listen in, essentially, what it amounts to. And you can do that for all kinds of reasons. So is there a corporate entity that is doing it? Is it a part of corporate espionage? Is it a non-state intelligence network, which Mike Pompeo alluded to during a speech at the State Department a couple of years ago? I don't know. I don't know. I have a pretty good idea who's behind it, but I'm not going to comment on that. Yeah.
There's a couple of things that are really interesting about this. Firstly, Semivan highlights that Havana Syndrome, something that we generally perceive to be a bit of a modern day mystery, like, wow, what is this technology that's able to directly interact with human brains? Very unusual. For Jim Semivan, it's like, look, this stuff was developed years ago. But what's most fascinating to me is how Semivan then ties this to a non-state intelligence network. And he's very sus about talking about this. Who is this non-state intelligence network? Could they be the same people responsible for simulating UFO events? Interesting food for thought. Talking about simulating UFO events, there's a deeper level to this as well. We've been talking about how you could interact and interface with the brain to maybe just create something inside of the mind. But what if there are also real craft involved as well? You may be familiar with the story of Antonio Villas-Boas. He was a farmer from Brazil who claimed to have been abducted in the 50s. So this is a very, very early abduction case, one of the earliest that we've got. There's a fantastic video by Think Anomalous where he documents the entire story of the abduction. And you can see that the people who come out of the craft, they're very humanoid. There are some really strange things that go on, but for the most part, it's only a couple steps away from a very human experience, but something that seems completely out of this world at the same time. What's really fascinating about the Villas-Boas abduction experience is that many years later, an individual called Bosko Nedelevic would come out saying that he was part of a CIA operation involved in simulating abduction hypothesis, and it was called Operation Mirage. I'm not going to read the full quote from it right now, but again, in Mark Pilkington's incredible book, Mirage Men, he documents this and highlights this evidence. An individual who claims that he was in Brazil as part of a CIA operation using really advanced technology to simulate these abduction experiences. It's on page 111 of Mirage Men. Read this book. This book is phenomenal. It teaches you all about the clever tricks involved in deception in the world of UFOs. And there's another really compelling example of a faked abduction case as well, which comes from this other fantastic book by Nick Redfern, Final Events. And in this, he talks about the case of an individual called Allison. And I'm going to read a section from this because I just find this one so interesting. A perfect example is the case of Allison, a now 41-year-old woman from Arizona who lives on a ranch not too far from the town of Sedona. From the age of 27 to 31, Allison says she was subjected to at least 5 abductions that bore all the hallmarks of alien kidnappings. On each occasion, she was in her living room, reading or watching television, when her 2 pet dogs, Lucy and Summer, began pacing around the room and whimpering. At that point, things always became a blur, and Allison later found herself several hours later in a different part of the house. Grogginess, a pounding headache, and a dry mouth were staples of the experience. For days after the weird encounters, she dreamed of the moment when things began to go awry, which always resulted in a complete loss of electricity inside the house, a deep humming noise emanating from outside the large living room window, and powerful and intensely bright lights enveloping the room. In her semi-conscious state, Allison saw small shadowy figures scuttling around the room who carried her outside onto a small craft where she was subjected to a gynecological examination and some sort of nasal probing. She was then returned to another part of the house and the aliens left. It was only after the aliens had departed that the intense humming noise ceased. This is where it gets interesting. During what Allison believes was the 5th abduction, however, something even weirder took place. The mysterious humming sound abruptly came to a halt only a few seconds after her allegedly cosmic visitors entered the room. At that point, Allison recalled, not in a later dream on this occasion, but in real time, she began to slowly regain her senses, and the feeling of disorientation eased and then completely vanished. And so did the aliens. In their place was not a group of frail-looking, black-eyed extraterrestrials, but a number of rather large and burly men in what looked like black combat fatigues. According to Allison, one of the men screamed into a microphone, "What happened?" The men backed away slowly, and, as Allison began to regain her senses, one of them held his hand up, as if to say, "Stay where you are," and uttered the word, "sorry," in her direction, in a rather awkward fashion. Allison made her way to the window in plenty of time to see the men jump into an unmarked black helicopter. At a height of several hundred feet, a powerful lamp was turned on that lit up the night sky around her secluded property. So much for a genuine spaceship. Now look, as always, we can't build an entire hypothesis about the UFO phenomenon just on one person's individual experience. But when you collectively put all of this stuff together, it builds a really compelling picture. Is it possible that people could be simulating the UFO phenomenon in order to drive some kind of secret agenda? And I think there's plenty of evidence that suggests that it might be possible. Even in 1977, bright, intelligent people were considering whether this was a possibility. It's now 2025. And I believe I have only managed to pull up a splattering of evidence that would support this hypothesis. I really feel like this is a good moment to play this clip from Jeremy Corbell talking about this idea that something is coming in 2027.
And they've been here a long time, and that's the truth. But the lie is coming. All indications, like all of them, is that that lie is going to be that there is a craft slowly making its way to us here on Earth. And that is the lie they're going to want you to believe. It's nuanced, how they explain that, the nature of that threat. But that 100% is the lie you are going to be told. You even got a date. People have been whispering a date for a long time now. I know where that lie comes from. I know specifically what document from the 70s initiated the idea of that lie. A classified document. That is the lie you will be told. You're going to be told that there is a craft on its way to Earth. That's the lie. Maybe I'm wrong. Hope I'm wrong.
At the very end of his book, Vallee puts forward a couple of hypotheses about what might be going on with the UFO phenomenon, about the sorts of motivations that might be involved. I'm going to read one of those hypotheses that's called the Martians. And I just think it's a really great way to summarize one of his ideas about what might actually be going on. Here it is. The codename Martians was first used by British intelligence during World War II, and it had nothing to do with the Red Planet. It referred to the spy industry that had been created to keep the Allied command informed on the moves and intentions of the Germans. The Martians were part of a giant apparatus of espionage and deception. The work of the Martians and their colleagues during the war included the manipulation of friend and foe alike to further the goals of global strategy. They were not concerned with the day-to-day operation of the war. Their only purpose was strategic deception. Invasions were faked. Phantom armies were deployed. Inflatable rubber tanks, tracks left in the desert sand, simulations of the sounds of an entire armada maneuvering in dense fog. Electronic countermeasures that enabled a single cargo plane to appear to be an attacking bomber fleet. Fake radio communications. Newspaper ads for useless services to non-existent forces. False letters to lovers of phantom soldiers attached to imaginary regiments. Sociological effects of entire armies assembling at false staging areas. All of these were common tricks for the Martians and their friends. The very existence of groups like this, whose techniques later inspired the disinformation practices of the Soviet KGB and similar work elsewhere, should make us extremely cautious about any kind of apparent evidence about flying saucers. What if the deception of World War II extended beyond the hostilities with Germany? What if the ghost rockets of 1946, which behaved so much like UFOs, were a continuation of the activities that used special means? What other weapons were at the prototype stage in the German arsenal? Could some of these have been used later, in Sweden and elsewhere, to support an even more ambitious stratagem? The simulation of an outer space invasion, the goal of which might have been to prevent a third world war by turning the thoughts of mankind towards an extraterrestrial goal, lending credibility to the notion of an impending invasion from space. A writer named Bernard Newman actually described such a scenario in his 1948 novel, The Flying Saucer. His book begins with a meeting of three remarkable men: a French spy master, an American physicist of Nobel Prize caliber, and a well-known writer. The meeting takes place at the end of World War II, as they contemplate the rubble and the despair around them, and they decide that another global conflict must be prevented at all costs. They're inspired by a newspaper account, which reads, "In his speech, Mr. Eden said that it seemed to be an unfortunate fact that the nations of the world were only really united when they were facing a common menace. What we really needed was an attack by Mars." Vallee continues, "Could someone be faking an extraterrestrial threat? The idea seems preposterous indeed. Is it less believable than the idea of General George Patton commanding an imaginary army corps armed with inflatable tanks and cardboard barracks? If Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union could jointly plan and carry out such a worldwide deception in the early 40s, could not the same mechanisms be at work now? Only a fraction of the deception techniques has been revealed. The institutions created to carry them out are still in existence, with their privileged communication channels, their hidden sources of procurement and capital, and their recruiting procedures. The answer to the question, could such an international group fake, use, or manipulate UFO activity, has to be yes." I'm not going to add too much else onto the end of what Vallee has said there. I think everything we've covered in both parts of this video should be evidence enough that we need to take that hypothesis seriously. I hope this has been a really helpful introduction, summary, elucidation, and expansion of Vallee's theories on the UFO phenomenon. I hope it's helped you to think more clearly about what might be going on around us today, and I'm grateful that you decided to click on this video and join me for this session today. Please do like and subscribe. Write a comment on your thoughts, your perspectives. I really appreciate it on a personal level. Every comment I read, genuinely, I'm not just saying this, I say it a lot. It just adds a lot to my life. And if you want to be generous today, write a comment talking about what you've learned. It doesn't even have to be positive, but I just really appreciate it. My name's Jason Samosa. This has been Jason Samosa's Ufology Moment. And until next time, cheers.